My guest today is Cass Smith, the Operations Manager at Urban Measure, and we're going to be talking RMS. So Cass, the first question is, what is RMS?
Well, the RMS stands for the Residential Measurement Standard. It was something that was put out by the Real Estate Council of Alberta last year. And basically what it is, it's a principle-based standard for measurements. And it was put out to everywhere across Alberta, to all real estate professionals. Just to basically put into context how something is actually measured and make sure that everyone's on the same page and that we're actually gaining some accuracy and consistency across the province of Alberta.
Okay, so we're comparing apples to apples then, basically. And is it just houses residential, or is it all properties?
Yeah, it's residential properties. So any like detached homes, attached homes, and condominiums mostly.
Why is that so important to have the RMS in place? What did we have before?
Well, I mean, there was the area guideline, but the what we had before wasn't something that was actually being enforced across Alberta. So, you mean you'd go to Calgary, and Calgary was, they were fairly sticky on what exactly was and was not square footage, but then you'd go to Edmonton and it'd be different. You'd go to Lethbridge and it'd be a little bit different. So you couldn't really compare anything properly. Everything varied just a little bit. So this way we can just put everything on the same playing field and we know what it is as long as it's in the province of Alberta.
All right, and that's important too, province of Alberta, because when we go outside provinces, I imagine the different jurisdictions have their own set of codes.
Yeah, absolutely. And as a company, we also operate in British Columbia, and theirs is completely different than what we have. And same with Ontario, Saskatchewan, Manitoba. There isn't really any parity for what's square footage and what's not, or what's actually part of a measurement guideline, and some don't even have a measurement guideline. So Alberta is the only one that really has, putting something together so that the entire province for sure is on the same page and properly enforced it.
So if we have buyers coming from out of province moving into Alberta, that's a good question for them to ask their realtor is, how does the square footage compare with the province that they've come from?
Yeah, exactly.
So that they've got a better idea of those comparisons.
Yeah, exactly. And you know what, the RMS itself is broken down into 9 principles that are fairly easy to understand in their lamest terms and explain to any consumer coming across of what exactly it is that they're looking at when they're looking at 2,000 square feet, what's actually included in their 2,000 square foot home.
Sure. Well, let's talk a little bit about that, because when you measure a home, there are certain guidelines, protocols that you have to keep in mind and that take place every time, and every home is different.
Yeah, absolutely. So I mean, for a regular detached home, and you're essentially taking your measurement to the outside of the finished surface of your foundation line. So basically, everything on the inside, with a few minor exceptions that I'll go through in a second here, is included, whereas an attached home, you're actually measuring from the inside of the perimeter walls, or like paint to paint, exactly, as it's commonly known, and same with condos, following that same paint to paint procedure.
All right, so we've got the exterior foundation perimeter measured for a detached home. Now we move inside, and a lot of realtors like myself, we're asking, okay, we would like this measured, and usually it's pretty standard for the main floor upstairs. Yeah. You also measure basements or lower floors. What's not included?
Well, essentially, from its basic point, regardless of whether it's detached or attached, everything above grade is what's included in the square footage. But beyond that, there are some different things that you would have to take into consideration when you're actually measuring your house. One being you have to have 5 feet of clearance. Usually that
vertical clearance.
Yeah, vertical clearance. Usually that comes into effect in houses with like a dormer style roofing and whatnot, and
or a bay window or something like that.
Absolutely, yeah. So, and basically the way that works is just the way you set it, from floor to ceiling. You have to have 5 feet of clearance. And if the room that we're in now had an area where it only had less than 5 feet of clearance, somewhere in that entire room, there has to be 7 feet of clearance, or you'd have to remove the entire room.
Interesting.
Then there's also open to below spaces and vaulted areas. So basically, essentially, if you can't walk on it, it's not included on that level.
Well, that only makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So, and then another one would be for cantilevers, they would actually have to be right at floor level. So they can't be raised. Like, for instance, a lot of kitchen sinks will have kind of like a plant window cantilever behind it, but you can't include that in your square footage.
Right.
It's not walkable
or
space.
a bay window sitting area, for instance, you can't include
Yeah,
that because
absolutely.
you can't walk on it.
Absolutely. And then one that had previously caused a bit of a gray area are additions and conversions. So essentially, I mean, a lot of people convert their garages, add on sunrooms, or a sunroom that previously was completely undeveloped. Maybe they spruced it up a bit. So there are some stipulations to whether you can include that as square footage as well. One being that it would have to have foundation or footings. It has to have a permanent heating source, not necessarily tied into the heating source from the house itself.
Right.
It can be separate. It just has to be a permanent source.
Okay.
And you also have to have electrical running to it. Now, you can't basically just run one vent from a house to a garage and then call the garage developed. It still has to be able to heat the space to 22 degrees Celsius year round. So although there is a bit of a judgment in that area, I mean, most places you can take a look at, like one vent isn't going to heat a 300 square foot area.
No, exactly. Now, back in the day, measuring tape was a standard for measuring houses. We've got technology has come a long way. So the tools that you use, are they primarily laser measuring devices?
Yeah, it's a handheld measuring device. Most of them are made by the same companies that make like surveyors equipment, like Leica and whatnot. And that's what we use to actually take our physical measurements. They're great because you can take them in to get calibrated at any surveyor's shop whenever you feel like it. And they can provide you a little bit more accuracy than measuring tape can. And then on top of that, we use a software that allows us to build out the house as we go and calculate the square footage, which obviously not only saves us a lot of time.
That's not the accumulation of the individual rooms, because you still have to allow for wall thickness on those exterior walls.
Absolutely, yeah. So on the exterior walls, we're including the wall thicknesses, obviously, and but what we can do with it is literally build the shape of the house itself, rather than trying to crawl underneath people's decks, or work around porches, or go through the garages and constantly have 2 people pulling a measuring tape everywhere.
Right.
We can use the laser measuring devices and then put it into our computers, which will do the calculation for us.
How accurate are the measurements, Cass? Do you still have challenges despite technology?
Oh, I mean, there's houses out there that will always cause difficulties. Normally, some of the larger custom homes, you get some rather obscure like penthouses and sub-penthouses that have some strange angles and whatnot. But the great thing about using the handheld device and the software together is that as you're building it, any errors will literally show themselves as long as you're following the principles properly. Because as I'm building the house right on my software, and I'm going around the entire house, eventually, if one of my numbers don't match up, there's a mistake somewhere, and I can
the
go back
software
through.
will indicate that.
Absolutely, yeah, and it shows this to us. I mean, I can't say that any profession is 100% human error free, but the great thing about it is that nearly almost always eliminates that issue for us. And then if there ever is a problem, we can go back and take a remeasure free of charge just to check our work.
The new RMS standard, Cass, has it eliminated some of those issues in terms of perhaps liability issues that may have cropped up before it was introduced?
Well, I mean, it has. I mean, off the get-go, obviously, anytime you introduce something new, there's going to be a lot of challenges, and especially with the RMS being very similar, but some of the main points were quite different from previous measurement standards, like the attached homes, and suddenly it's bringing everything a little bit smaller. What it has done is forced a lot of real estate professionals and even measurement companies, for that matter, to be a little bit more accountable for what they're actually measuring to.
Right.
There's something very concrete with 9 principles that you have to go through, and that you need to follow. And the great thing about it is that Rika's been good at responding to any questions that we've come across that aren't covered in the principle,
right.
And because some of them can be up for interpretation. And for the most part, from our client standpoint, they've told us that they've basically been able to contact them to get clarity on some of those issues. But I mean, in terms of the liability of it, more so than even just that, it's actually put everyone, in the same category, right. Where you and I are both measuring a condo the same way. Whereas, I mean, you could have had a 2-bedroom condo previous, and I could have had a 2-bedroom condo, but if you were using registered size and I was doing paint to paint, regardless of what the condo was like, yours would have looked more appealing to the general public.
Right, and so that's really the significant change, is that it puts everything on that same level playing field.
Absolutely.
In terms of measurement.
Yeah, and I mean, recently they've definitely started enforcing it a lot more, and I've found that from brokers that have approached me over the past year just to kind of discuss services and whatnot, that they're also taking a part in kind of leading the charge to make sure that their realtors are also following everything correctly, sure. And that when they're getting everything done, like for instance, from us, we'll actually provide everyone back we call it a measurement schematic. You might be here called a few different things. Basically, a measurement outline of what's actually included in your guideline. And a lot of brokers are starting to request those to be mandatory with every listing that they hand in. So I think even if it hasn't hit every single agent individually, it is starting to trickle down to them, from RECA to their brokers to the individual real estate boards, and everyone's kind of gotten on board and making everyone accountable.
And it is having that positive impact.
Yeah.
What challenges have you come across? I mean, you mentioned certain houses might have a few things that you have questions on, and you're able to refer those to the Real Estate Commission for your answers. Mm-hmm. Is there anything else that's cropped up, or is there any other thing that you would like to add about RMS, Cass?
Yeah, I mean, basically, in terms of like difficult houses, every house can be figured out and it can be measured, and whether we just have to send an additional tech there to do it or take a little bit more time on site, you can always figure them out. The biggest challenge for us was, I mean, we've been around since 2003, measuring under a variety of different guidelines that were, some of them were enforced more than others, but because the RMS was province-wide and that it was mandatory for all real estate professionals, the amount of back-end questions that we've had to answer have gone up an incredible amount. And the biggest one would be, anyone that has an attached home, you could have potentially just dropped anywhere from 100 to 200 square feet going from measuring from the outside previously to the inside. So a lot of it has to do with, explaining to our clients, homeowners, that the house didn't change size.
Sure,
the builder didn't rip you off.
Yeah.
Absolutely, the measurement guideline changed.
And that's an important point. You mentioned that the builder. Well, builders have different guidelines in terms of what they're able to sell to the public. But once that home is purchased, now that purchaser, if he was to resell the home, falls under the new RMS guidelines.
Yeah.
And that's where you could end up with a difference in size and square footage.
Yeah, absolutely. And normally for most detached homes, it's usually not something outrageous. I mean, every once in a while we've come across some weird things where they might have assigned the wrong blueprint to the house or something, but for the most part, it's usually fairly small differences. So, I mean, normally if you're looking at a house, okay, I'm purchasing it from the builder at 2,000 square feet, you can have a relative confidence that that's close. The RMS would come back as something different.
Sure.
But, I mean, we're not talking, a couple hundred square feet.
No.
Usually,
and that's where you get questions from the public, I presume, would be split levels or bi-levels. People are asking on a split level, well, how come, my house isn't 2,000 square feet, it only shows up as 1,200, and that's because of the below grade standard that is now.
Yeah, and absolutely, and that's something that, RECA's been very, very sticky about. So if any part of a level of a house is below grade, that entire level is below grade. Normally you see it on 4-level splits, where they'll have a lower level, which typically would be a walkout as well.
Correct.
And in years past, the majority of it's above grade. You wouldn't even question it, especially if you live there for a while. Like, I don't know, it's the lower level of our house, it's all above grade. And now when you really look at it, and you're like, well, actually, technically, based on the guideline, it's not. And we've come across some variety of unique situations, and basically the rule of thumb that REEC has put out to us, as well as a lot of the clients that I've talked to, has been that, even if it's close, like if it's remotely below, any piece of it is below, the entire thing is below.
All right, not
so, but I mean, and it can, that's too bad in some cases, and but under the same token, everyone's on the same playing field for it.
Sure. Cass, thank you very much.
Yeah, not a problem.
Cass Smith, Operations Manager for Urban Measure.